Part 3. The City of Confusion. December 4th. Alors, il va venir. Who's coming? Wilson! Even the femme de ménage, wrinkled and fat old Sybil, has that fact in the front of her consciousness. She stands where the light full on her many shades of bulging, striped blue calico, watching the doughboys hobble by. Pauvre gars, poor boys. He'll come and visit them. That's what presidents do. Visit the men they have maimed and ruined for life. Why did their mothers send them so far, madame? I wouldn't do as much. But they say he's different from the other rulers, Wilson. What does madame think? Moi? A shrug indicating that all rulers are alike. Now she is on her knees, absorbing everything she encounters on the floor. A scrap of paper, a match, dust, into her grey cloth, wringing it into the pail, and returning it to the floor with a vicious slop. The only way to prevent her from talking incessantly is to shut your eyes and to pretend to sleep. I feel so happy today that I can't do otherwise than look at the world and smile. Yellow roses like Florence in May. Yellow mimosa like Mediterranean roads between high walls. Madame is better, at last. That's easily seen. Ah, madame, there were days when you were grey as my cloth. Horrible comparison. I said to my daughter, she won't come out of it, madame. The lady. Yes, there were days. But this morning, when my nurse pulled back the door of my wardrobe to get a blanket, an almost familiar face looked at me from the mirror instead of a grim stranger. I don't dare say it, but I feel well. The flow of conversation goes on. Eh bien, madame, s'il y a des petits Boches qui resteront en France, il y aura des petits Français en Allemagne. Looking at me meaningly. Et des autres puissances aussi. Well, madame, if there are little Boches who'll stay in France, there are also some little French in Germany. And other powers as well. The Boches women, they like Frenchmen much better than Boches. That's funny, eh? I was talking yesterday with a prisoner just back. He told me, well, the Boches are brutes. Frenchmen aren't like that. She stopped short, and the subtle shadow of memory passed over her poor, scrubby old light and mysterious and colored as a butterfly's wing and gone as quickly. Les Américains non plus, ils ne sont pas brutaux. Ils sont chic, les Américains. The Americans aren't brutal either. They are chic, the Americans. Who knows what further revelations on the subject of the puissance, powers, in the Rhineland I should have had if Miss O had not appeared just then with my steaming bathwater. She luckily can't understand a word the scrubwoman says, won't even try to learn French because it would be no use in Dakota, and thinks her such a good old lady. Miss O, too, gives the heartiest welcome to my new feelings of health, and her face shines with sympathy for me when she lifts my cast gently, and there is only a bearable twinge. My sudden release from the intense subjective repression pain insists on will mean a lot to my nurse, too. I shan't be such an interesting patient from now on, but ever so much more sociable if I don't have to hold on to myself so tight all the while, if I am really freed from this iron-bound cell. Apparently in the little hospital world, with its mixture of French and American nurses, the entente has been revived on the warmest terms by the prospects of the president's arrival. The transition stage, since the armistice, between the cycle of danger and death and the cycle of peace and reconstruction, has been trying in Paris. Nerves were all unstrung, and nobody knew the meaning of the cryptic words written so large on the sky. Peace! Nobody knows yet, but one may believe the best, for something is going to happen at last. Wilson is coming. While she brushes my hair, I read Miss O's selections from the President's address to Congress, on the eve of his departure, published in this morning's Herald. The gallant men of our armed forces on land have conscientiously fought for ideals which they know to be the ideals of their country. I have sought to express these ideals. They have accepted my statements of them as in substance their own thoughts and purpose, as the associated governments have accepted them. I owe it to them to see to it, as far as is in me lies, that no false or mistaken interpretation is put upon them. It is now my duty to play my full part in what they offered, their lives, their blood, to obtain. So far, so good. The Republican Congress criticizes him for not being explicit about what his full part implies. But we very well know, I tell my attentive listener, to what he is committed in the hearts of the liberals of the world. A knock. The doctor. My nurse displays a transformed patient, and he, after one rather surprised glance, sits down astride the white chair, puts his boots on the rounds and his plump chin on the back, lights a cigarette, twists his stubby brown mustache, and begins, while little devils of humor play across his face, to inveigh against that great and good man, President Wilson. Sitting up in my turn against my pillows, I feel for the first time in nearly 2 months an ardent need for controversy. It seems to me I have done nothing but listen since October 19th. Listen very literally for dear life, to prevent the dark, silent waters of oblivion from closing over my head. Now I am afloat on the stream again. I want to talk. I want to answer back. The doctor, a Francophile convaincu, thoroughgoing, reads the official reactionary press and echoes every view. There is no safety for France save in a permanent system of military alliances. Germany must be completely crushed. The League of Nations is a pipe dream. Wilson is a utopian whom most of America does not follow, anyhow, coming over to meddle in subjects too big for him. I, a Francophile convaincu of another school, deny everything with fury. Quote in rebuttal Joe Ho, the CGT, who says Wilson's word, his alone in any governmental office, have gone straight to the heart of the masses. In opposition to a paix à la Bismarck, which would only be a break, a halt before the inevitable recurrence of the horrors we have just endured, rises le paix Wilson, radiant, within our grasp. My dear woman, you don't believe a word of it. You are much too intelligent. Have a cigarette? Come now, un peu de courage, a little courage. Miss O, who has been sitting stiffly by, jaw-dropping at our lively exchanges, gapes still further when I accept. And the doctor looks at me as if I were not a patient, but yes, a human being he hasn't noticed before. I return the compliment and observe him through the cigarette smoke. He is, well, perhaps 10 years younger than I had given him credit for. Not over 40? War service makes heavy lines. I must stop addressing him in a fatherly manner. He resents it. Eternally a beau, like all Southerners, though he looks, in that white hospital gown in which he lolls and expands, absurdly like a bourgeois rampagnois, a middle-class man in a dressing-gown. What a gifted raconteur, storyteller. He is laying himself out to amuse me, and himself. Conjures up the Carolina of his childhood, the Georgia of his youth, the French front of his prime. Backgrounds, people, characteristics, warmed with Southern sentiment and seasoned with a large pinch of Gallic salt. We have got to the anecdote of a Negro from Georgia who had volunteered in the French army at the instance of his friend, the King of the Fiji Islands, when an irate surgical nurse pushes open the door. Her eye unfortunately falling on the cigarette stubs, she turns very red and inquires whether Dr. M has forgotten his dressings, his operation. He gives me a sheepish look that conceals a sparkle of triumph. It is good for these women to wait around for a man. He had kept them guessing for 2 hours by using me as a refuge. Au revoir, monsieur. I'll convert you to Wilson yet. Jamais de la vie. Over my dead body. Miss O's nose seems to be a little out of joint. She brushes up the ashes with an injured and disapproving air, and when I make no comment, remarks that the doctor will have to learn to make his social calls in the afternoon. Right from the point of view of your routine, my dear. On the other hand, if a perfect patient is a passive piece of hospital furniture, then I begin to see my days of perfection are numbered. All right. Afternoon. The most heavenly rest I can remember after lunch. I went to sleep and woke up with the still amazing sensation of being afloat on the river of life, instead of struggling to keep eyes and ears above water, and savoured my hospital tea as if it were a meal at the Tour d'Argent. In the midst of it, Corinna ushered in, seeming, the straight, vivid creature, with her glowing cheeks and bright, melting, friendly eyes, and her heaps of abounding gifts, to hail from some halcyon clime, one of those lands of peace and plenty that make the background of old Italian pictures. Is it only that I now see clearly, instead of through a medium of cloudy or feverish feelings, or is America really a halcyon land? Sue, who soon followed her in, hasn't yet found just the right niche in the YMCA. A little regrets important work at home. But Corinna was crowned with her glorious French achievement, and wore the usual scalps at her belt. She was fresh from the liberated North, reeking with its woes, full of plans for the children of the frontier, projecting a trip to Germany with General Pershing. Franco-American comparison obtrude themselves these days, as they did in 1917. Then because it was the beginning, now because it is the end. 2 French women have just been here, Madame P.H., wife of my friend the writer on labor subjects, and Mademoiselle G., a nurse high up in the French Service de Santé, health service, who after 4 years in the war zone still directs a group of military hospitals. Madame P.H., a delicious little shy French flower plucked in a cottage garden, pink and white and demure, with a perfume of rare gentleness and sweetness. Mademoiselle G., just the opposite type, a plain, independent, middle-aged spinster, big-boned, big-hearted, progressive, and a feminist. I can't help contrasting their air of immemorial patience, even the younger woman has it, with Corinna's keen edge of vitality. Even among American nurses who have served with the Allied armies, women like Miss Bullard, there's probably not one whose stoicism and whose responsibility can compare with Mademoiselle G.'s. As for Madame P.H., she has, incredible in so fragile and home-keeping a creature, experienced in her own person the very horrors about which Corinna has talked so eloquently. She has been a refugee, driven from a stricken city in the north, holding 2 little children by the hand, another coming, leaving behind a husband mobilized, a house, all her earthly possessions. Yes, the war service of French women stands out as inevitable, prosaic, planted in fortitude, whereas our overseas service, at least, is something we have gone to seek, a high adventure. Our American women have, by and large, contributed the same element the American soldiers have to the war: moral stimulus, physical vitality, a new, constructive approach to a worn subject, a disbelief in obstacles. But our work, even at its most unselfish, has not been a sacrifice. The palms of martyrdom go to our French sisters. December 6. The boundaries of my narrow world are beginning to bulge and crack. I have had my first afternoon out of bed. They lifted me onto the chaise longue and wrapped me up, and I stayed with the doors wide open for 2 hours. The idea is to get strength and confidence enough to try crutches on Christmas Day. Watching the little garden cosmos of tents and wounded doughboys and hurrying nurses. How easily and effectively it turns on its own axis. So indifferent to one's wretched private miseries. But how damp and forlorn the tents are. I had almost forgotten. I was accosted from the garden door by a mutilated blue devil from the Grand Palais, who had a collection of hideous souvenirs made out of copper shell cases to sell. He had only 1 leg and part of a jaw, and told me he was going to manifest for Wilson and the Société des Nations with the Fédération Ouvrière des Mutilés and the CGT. He had the Populaire in his pocket, and pointed out with a bitter twist of his cheek this passage: "A man is coming who has kept in the terrible drama a pitiful heart, a right conscience, a clear brain. We salute him and we say, be faithful to yourself. You have wanted to win to be just. Be just." December 13. Impossible to think of anything but the George Washington drawing nearer and nearer to the coast of France. The French working class, the socialists, the people, as distinguished from official France, seem determined to give Wilson a mandate in their cause. Politics are mixed up in it, but the cri de coeur, outcry, is unmistakably there too. The Journal du Peuple says, "No man since Jesus, not even Jaurès, has so strongly embodied the hope of the world. For the peasant, as for the man of letters, for the workman and the artist, this name represents divine wisdom."